For those who don't know me, I am not Adam Samples. I am, in fact, filling in for him this morning because life. My name is Jamie, and I am the Director of Communications for Atrium Staffing and Contingent Workforce Solutions. Diversity, inclusion, and opportunity are three things I am quite passionate about. My background is that of growing up in a small town in Alabama with 52% Black and 48% white population. My education from pre-K through college included many lessons on the importance of inclusion. And had it not been for sponsoring my talents and mentoring me and offering me a job and relocation opportunity to better my life, I would not be here talking with you today. So I would love to share that story and that of the two incredible women who are here with me today about how we can further those opportunities for others in an inclusive environment. Gratefully, as a communications leader, I have the platform to sponsor the conversation. So I want to share the mic with the two women who are virtually beside me today, co-founder and CEO of Simba, Ava Sadeghi, and Senior Managing Director of Workplace Innovation at Cushman & Wakefield, Rachel Casanova. So welcome, both of you guys. Thank you so much for joining. And rather than me telling everyone about the amazing accomplishments that you both have, because believe me, there are a lot of them, I'd love if you could share a little bit about your differences together with us, the ones we see, the ones we don't see, and the value of those differences and how they lend to thoughts and actions at work. So together we can talk about what we can do within our work environments, whether physical or remote, to validate our brand missions and continue building inclusive workplaces beyond office walls. So Ava, can you share a little bit about your background and mission?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Jamie, for having me. It's such an honor to be on this panel with Rachel and share more about the work we're doing at Simba. I was very excited when you reached out to be a part of the conversation. And a fun fact is this is actually my very first LinkedIn Live, so excited to be here with everyone. And my background is in social impact and human rights. My family is from Iran, so I'm a first-generation Iranian-American woman. And I've always been very passionate about human rights since the very first time I traveled to Iran. And so I was supposed to be a doctor, engineer, but decided to become a tech CEO and founder of Simba. I created Simba when I was a fellow with Congressman John Lewis for civil and human rights in Atlanta. So my personal mission and our whole team's mission is to help open up the workforce at the very entry of early talent and opportunities for students and candidates really all around the U.S. and the world. So excited to be a part of this conversation, share what I've learned in the remote work setting and our insights from Simba. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. We are so glad you were here with us. And Rachel, if you don't mind, can you share a little bit about your background and mission?
Sure, great. Well, it might help even just to start with my mission. So I've been in the workforce about 25 years, and my entire background is around how do we build a place that supports people coming together in the mission of organizations and businesses. And to do that well, it's really about being user-centric and listening. And I think that's just such an important piece, especially right now where preconceived notions are the ones that we're saying, are they really the ones we should be focused on? So it's really been the mission of what I do is to listen and try to synthesize and make sure we hear underrepresented voices in doing so. I am a New Yorker who moved and lived in North Carolina for 10 years after I graduated from college. Believe it or not, a bigger transition than I maybe thought it might be. We're a diverse family. My husband is Hispanic. I have two kids who are both in high school now and sort of are still trying to figure out their identity. So certainly an interesting component.
Absolutely. Rachel, I was actually listening to your podcast recently and really appreciated the point that you make about the changes that we've gone through recently, just as people and as organizations over these past months, and how challenging it could be to go back to a physical work environment that has potentially remained the same. You know, after such an enormous evolution, it could possibly be not that inspiring based off of all the change that's happening all around us. So could you tell us a little bit about that and what it means as far as our efforts to reach diverse audiences and sponsor inclusive experiences at work?
Yeah, and I think one of the points in your question should not be overlooked. You said people and organizations, and that scale is so important to always think about, because we're individuals. Experiences are made up of many individuals that actually make up an organization. And those are the ones that if we mute those flavors, it all looks pretty vanilla. And so we've always used place as a way to bring culture and brand and expectations on behaviors, but we never had a chance to really pause and stop, right? There's always been this, it exists, we maybe make shifts, but it exists. We now have an opportunity where everyone left that for a good amount of time. What we thought might be a blip was not as much a blip. It's really had allowed people to identify what was working and what wasn't. And it's always been an issue that in the real estate world, we design things that are supposed to last 7 to 10 years, but the pace of people changing and of organizational change happens much faster than that. So we have new eyes to see some of the perhaps mistakes or assumptions that were made. And that's what is so exciting right now. And, you know, as the stresses, aside from the pandemic that we've seen with racial injustice over the last 6 months, those eyes are even, they're wider to figure out what was working, what isn't, why do we come together? And I like to draw upon not just why do we come together at work, but why do we go to a sporting event? Why do we go to a concert? Why do we go to a religious institution? What is it that we get out of coming together? And how can we be more responsive to different needs when people come back?
Absolutely. I think they're great points, and something I can definitely relate to. Part of my culture growing up was the feeling of gathering and use of the word y'all, which was, you know, all
I learned it living in North Carolina.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I appreciate a lot of the community that come from being, you know, in a physical place together. And, you know, whether we call it the employer brand or just the brand, having these shared values and missions that are actionable within the workplace, there's certainly something to be said about that.
And Jamie, what I would add to that is we often say that it is like the body language of an organization. Now, let's not assume it's the only body language. And I know in our preparation of the conversations with Ava, we're talking about some of the remote or distributed work. It's not to say there aren't other ways, but people will make an assumption that what you build, what you create, is your brand. And so when it doesn't represent, when it doesn't communicate the organization as it is intended to, or is not deliberately planned for, it's compromising. So how do we use that as a tool? It's not the only tool, but as we think about that, we really need to think more carefully about those journeys that people take.
Absolutely. And as individuals, you recognize we're each unique, whether it's how we identify with our race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, abilities, ideologies. You know, we're constantly learning from one another and learning about each other's strengths. It's how we build phenomenal teams and leverage that within an organization to be the best. So Ava, you know, I'm wondering how in a virtual environment we can really do this successfully. And from your experience, what is changing? What has remained the same when it comes to these inclusive experiences?
Thank you, Jamie, for that question. And I'd also, love to chime in too. I think, Rachel, you brought up so many incredible points about place, about community, and about belonging. And when I think about a workplace, it is people coming from all those different types of communities and bringing their own shared experiences from other places and joining a workforce, which is, oftentimes to create business value. And so integrating that can be really challenging. And we kind of talked about this yesterday because remote work is just fundamentally different than working in an office. It is a different space. And so I know with Simba and remote internships, oftentimes we remind people that, a remote internship is just very different than an in-person internship. So you actually have to design a brand new workplace because your workplace is not in an office anymore. It is remote. And so you have to ask yourself different questions, and you have to change your mindset from being like, how do I transform every single thing that's happening here and put it remotely the same way? Because you can't. It's like, two different shapes, and you have to adapt and, and figure out what works well for your organization and how you map that out. In addition to that, one thing I'd like to note is that remote work doesn't look like this normally. We are in a pandemic where not only do we not have the ability to go to the office, but we also don't have the ability to, go out to coffees or have a lot of the social aspects of our lives that's also taken away. So my worry is that a lot of people are kind of equating to this remote world to what remote work is. And they're also very different too, because remote teams are flexible. We see that, Facebook, Twitter, Square, they made announcements that employees can be remote forever. So we're seeing that a lot of companies coming out and make these announcements. And so I think the three kind of things I put together today to share with the audience listening in that I've learned from virtual settings and teams that have done remote internships successfully and hybrid models of work is first, you have to care about your team. This is a challenging time where, it is a pandemic. You have to check in with them. So one thing that we do at Simba, and I know a lot of other teams do, is during your stand-ups and check-ins with individuals, you have an emotional, physical, intellectual check-in where you ask them, how are you doing? How are things going? One thing we do at Simba is this notion called green, yellow, red. And so I asked my co-founder, Nikita, are you green, yellow, red before we start the meeting? Like before we dive into deliverables, anything business related, how are you? Are you red? Do you need to go take care of something before we start this meeting? And that's okay if you do, because you can't really be focused if you're not in the right setting. And another thing that you can do to show care for your team is encourage virtual coffee chats. So when we onboard a new team member, we have every single person go through a virtual coffee chat with everyone. We're a smaller team of 12, so we can do that. But making sure that your organization fosters that one-to-one connection, even if it's in a virtual space. And then the second point I have is make sure that you design your workplace practices and processes to ensure inclusion. So that means designing meeting agendas where everyone can speak, because we all know in Zoom, if you take yourself off of mute, all of a sudden, it's very hard to facilitate a conversation and ensure the processes are still flowing. So you can design an agenda where you give like a 2-minute stand up to each person and then have like a popcorn style of making sure that you listen to everyone. And then the final thing on that note is making sure that projects are collaborative. Make sure that your team members aren't working on projects siloed from one another. Even in a remote space, see how you can interact with others. Make sure that people are working across departments and within their team to make sure projects happen, so that they're still having some sort of level of communication and interaction with the team, so that you can promote that sense of retention. But I think that making sure that you show that care for your team, as well as designing your workplace to ensure that everyone has a sense of belonging, is very, very important in a remote space.
Absolutely. And sense of belonging is something that we're talking a lot about these days at work and, school and just within our communities in general. And I think it does bring a great debate to, having that physical workspace where you're building something that is tangible, or an engagement activity, where people are in a room together. But like you said, similarly, in a virtual environment, you can kind of create that if you're asking the right questions. Rachel, I'm curious, have you seen any examples of how people have really changed their physical environment or adapted it, to kind of flow between a remote and a virtual environment to accommodate, a lot of these changes that are happening?
So I'd love to say yes, but I have to say that we're still in this storm. And so we know that even when organizations have opened their doors, and this is true around the globe, that they're still seeing less than 10% of occupancy on any given day. So we're really kind of waiting to see the light at the end of the tunnel for people to want for people to figure it out. And there's a lot of surveys. We implemented a global survey of 50,000 people about their experience at home. So we certainly have evidence of what's working well and what's not, and perhaps giving us cues to what we will need. The temptation is to say, oh, people want to come together for community. And of course, but obviously ways that they're creating community virtually. And I have to think that we're not so disciplined in the world of work today where we can say, I'm going to focus on Monday, I'm going to collaborate on Tuesday, and so I'll come into the office when I want those things. So I think when we think about the workplace on the other side of this, it is really a continuum, and some organizations were probably already adapted to a different way of working. Those who had opened the door to remote working doesn't mean that if someone was 100% remote, but some remote, some in the office, the hybrid that Ava just mentioned. So what we're anticipating is just greater choice and losing the assumption that people come in to sit at a desk first and then do other things. But the opportunity to create places where lots of people can do lots of things. And if we don't make the assumption first that I need a desk, but first that I need other kinds of places, and that's really treating the whole person. So one person might want a place for quiet, and one person might want a place just to run into people. But those needs, I think, we see is growing. And at the same time, the pressures of the cost of real estate is expensive, especially in many urban areas. So how do we do that in the same footprint? And the way that's going to happen is to embrace that people don't always have to sit at a desk first, but how do we create environments for these other work modes and have some desks when people need that.
Yeah, I love that.
Amy, by the way, Ava. So.
I think she might join back in and pop back in, but I'd love to just add on to what you mentioned, because when I think of success as an organization, that means making sure that every team member and every individual, as you mentioned, everyone needs something different, is in that environment to succeed. Some people are very great at being on their couch and being an amazing developer, and being in their own space, in their own setting, actually makes them very comfortable and can ensure that they are more productive. So, it's really important that if you want to build a successful organization, that you foster that sense of, flexible mentality. There was actually some research that I was reading on of some organizations that did research that if they offered flexible options, they increased some opportunities by 70%. And developers did this survey with McKinsey saying that they would send 50% of them look for flexible or remote options when considering where to work. So, it can be a benefit as well for a lot of these teams trying to attract great talent.
That's right. And I think the temptation is to think in terms of departments or functions. And I do think we have an opportunity to sort of peel that onion back as well, because what works for me as someone who lives in the suburbs, who is a parent, who has my work modes, that if we allow people to choose what works for them, rather than saying, well, the accounting department should do it this way and developers should do it that way, we'll never be able to get to all of the nuance. But to give people the choice allows them to be successful, as you said. And Jamie, welcome back.
Thanks.
We were just talking about some of those changes you might make to the workplace. I said we did this survey, but I didn't really give you any of the results. But what we're seeing, I don't think any of the organizations in the 50,000 respondents are fully remote workplaces. So we have to anticipate that some organizations had some experience, and those people who've had experience working remotely are having a better experience now. We can imagine all the reasons why. The ability to focus pretty much remained the same, which tells me that maybe all the blame of the office not being able to focus is maybe the nature of work, or our peers are not interrupting us, but now the stresses of home are. But focus didn't have a large difference. We've seen the ability to collaborate definitely be going up, but we've seen bond and connection to culture, my individual sense of belonging, were depleted, or depleting, I should say. And as it's not only our survey, but we've seen others, that there is a continuation of that depletion, and that mental health, which was stated early on by CEOs, take care of yourself. And we wondered, is this going to stick around, or is this going to become an HR issue in the future? It seems like it's sticking around, that to be healthy and to be effective and successful means I need emotional strength, I need physical energy, I need spiritual and sort of belonging to something bigger, and mental energy. So I think as we think about that, I think our opportunity is to design to recognize this more deliberately.
Absolutely. I think I'm a good example of one of those people. When I started my career, it was a lot of remote work. And so I feel like now I have some habits that I learned from one of my first jobs ever that like I've taken with me, even things as simple as I pick up the phone and call colleagues, you know, not for work purposes, but just to, you know, say hello and have a conversation. Because it's like a social skill that I learned at work from the beginning. And I think that, along with upskilling and getting people connected with some of these technologies, that can help us be better at those things. You know, it's evolved from my cord telephone that I used to use. But it's the same concept, right? It's keeping people connected, making sure that we're balancing or integrating, you know, personal together with work, and that everyone is in their best self mode so that they can perform and produce the results that everyone is looking for at work.
I might also push back a little bit on that too, because I think that I think you should invite your colleagues to feel comfortable sharing about their personal work. But I also think there shouldn't be this sense of I must share a lot at work, because I do think that there is a sense of division of work and personal life that as a startup founder myself, I've had to learn how to embrace, and also lead by example to show my team members that I try to get offline at a certain time. I try to sleep at a certain time, because it's great if the CEO says, take care of yourself, but doesn't really show you how to do it, or doesn't have any wellness programs in action. Like what we do on Wednesdays, we have Wednesday Wellness at noon. No matter how crazy busy things are, I make sure that we do our Wednesday Wellness, and I'm always present. And it's whether it's a meditation session, a yoga session, I'm always actively there. But I think, you know, I invite team members to share their personal life, but I don't make it more a requirement or make people feel uncomfortable about it, because I do think at the end of the day, you want to make people feel included in the business sense, and invite them to have the presence they'd like to within their own workspace.
And I think this is obvious, and this is not my main work, but I'm constantly uncovering these issues, especially in large organizations. The mid-levels, those that people report to, those who unfortunately or fortunately control whether I am successful and judged successful and have my job next month, are not all equally equipped. And so it's easier for leaders to say, this is what we believe in and this is what we're going to do. And it's easy for employees to make the choice, I work here because I believe in that or I don't. There's a huge amount of people in the middle who can make or break these programs. And and they're going through their own transition and their own translation of what that means from leadership. So, you know, it goes back to people saying, in the future, we expect we're going to have a work from home program. The reality is most organizations had some work from home program. It might have been the relationship I had with my manager, and it wasn't in the books and it wasn't a formal remote program, but these things were happening. And if we're not careful and don't invest in those people who manage others, this is really hard to implement and to do it with equity, and what those needs are, and understanding, the manager's needs as well as its individual employees. We've looked at mobility programs and remote programs for the last 20 plus years. Many have reversed them. You think about Bank of America, Yahoo, IBM, Best Buy, TIA, Kraft. They've had significant remote work programs, and within 10 to 12 years, all of the ones I named have sort of undone them. And I don't think it's that they don't believe in it, but I think they weren't equipped to invest in the things that make that really work. And when we're all remote, there is that digital equality. And I'm careful not to say that everyone's home experience is the same, but how they engage in work, they have this equality of voice. So my ability to mute or unmute on that Zoom call is the same as yours, Ava. But when some people are not there and some people are, I think what we're at risk of is seeing a lack of normalcy. Now we've got interpretation and it's going to happen differently. And that's where those programs can really struggle. And someone says, you know what, maybe we don't want this because it's not working.
I think that's actually one of the biggest points. I personally am obsessed over learning because I think you nailed it. I think the hybrid model of work that we're going to see going back to the workforce is going to be so difficult to master. I look at organizations like Automatic that are fully remote, and they've nailed it, and they've done a very successful job. They even do their interview process through Slack to see how good they can message on Slack and work remotely. But I do think there's going to be a major challenge with the ones who are in person versus the ones who are remote, because the people who are in person might have a sense of belonging or a sense of after dinner or afternoon happy hours, and that engagement that is going to be difficult to get without hybrid model. I know HubSpot did some research that in the next decade, over 80% of teams will have at least one person who is remote or a hybrid, team member. And I think it's going to create challenges. So at Simba, we're trying to learn how do you build those communities online across hybrid teams and make everybody feel welcome. But I have not yet seen an organization who's perfectly mastered that.
Ava, are you seeing that a lot of these companies, especially the technology companies, are able to grow opportunity because of the remote technology, or is it limiting in any way?
Definitely. We're amazed to see how resilient a lot of organizations that we partnered with this summer. And not only did they stand up remote internship programs overnight, because a lot of planning goes into hosting an internship program. So many stakeholders, managers come together to host a very short experience. And so in May, they were turning the switch to design the entire thing remotely and figure out how they were going to do that. And now that we were checking in, doing our final reviews over the summer, we were amazed to hear that many of them not only are going to be scaling, over 60% of our users are scaling their programs on Simba, some of them scaling by over 600% of the number of interns, because they said, now we've built out a scalable model that we can actually invite more students that don't even need a desk to experience what it's like in the workplace and learn what it's like to work remotely. So for us, that was our whole mission. How do we open up the workforce? Because when we did our research with remote internships, companies kept telling us we just don't have the capacity to scale remotely. We just have not built the infrastructure in place. And having a lot of these in-person internships, we don't have enough seats at the table. So I think that it's been really rewarding to see the positive growth. And a lot of the students say, this is a workforce revolution where we're able to access opportunity in a whole new way. And so that's what we're seeing from our end. But it's important that companies are not just mass scaling, that they have a mentor program in place, that they ensure everyone has a meaningful experience. And so that's why we even came up with the name Simba, for symbiotic relationships, because you want everyone at both stages to be winning. And I think that's a really powerful philosophy for a good organization, is that, not only is the business and the organization winning and hopefully generating revenue, but it's also giving back to the livelihood, the happiness, the inclusion of all of its team members and individuals that makes that business flourish.
Absolutely. Rachel, I think I also heard on your podcast, about extending the fairness from the mission, to reach everyone equally in a way where you're offering the same experience to a client that you're offering, to your employees and to potential talent, maybe some of the early talent that Ava's working with. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think as you were saying, Ava, what you were in our previous calls, I work in the real estate industry, I've worked in the architectural industry, and there's definitely, we can do better when it comes to the candidates, and people say, we don't see leadership that looks diverse, and the question is, are we getting the right candidates? And my bend is, how do we, if you do have the candidate, how do you convey that this is a place for all? So being thoughtful to, if someone is an underrepresented voice and comes in and doesn't see anyone that looks like them and doesn't see things that represent that they could be successful there, you're turning away a candidate before, or they're turning away before you maybe have already turned it away. What I think is interesting when we think about the journey of starting at an internship level is people will say, well, we don't see those candidates. Well, this is an opportunity to learn from a new set of candidates that for one reason or another may not be the ones, quote, walking through your doors. And so I think it's just a really interesting opportunity to think about how we tell that story and how we engage people throughout the life cycle of work. And certainly from a client perspective, Jamie, there's a question of how do your clients know what you represent? And again, we often think in terms of place, but it's people, it's place, it's how we present ourselves. Do we present and recognize that we want to be like, I mean this in the right way, to be like our clients, like as our clients are on this journey as well, how do we embrace and demonstrate and be something different than maybe what we've been in our industries prior?
It is a lot to think about. You guys are a wealth of information and insight, so I really appreciate sharing all of your experiences with us. Are there any challenges that either one of you are still seeking a solution for, or do you feel like you've been in this long enough that you've kind of found your way in what works for you and your organization to be inclusive and to reach those diverse audiences?
Well, I can just quickly speak to what's not solved and what I'm looking for more data to diagnose. And I think we talked a little bit about the idea of something called organizational network analysis. And the idea, just compare it to your social network analysis, your LinkedIn network, your any other social media network. Who are those people? How far reaching? How many of them are truly active relationships? You apply that to an organization, and Dr. Karen Stevenson, who kind of invented this concept, projects that there are 6 different networks that we form. We form, a knowledge network, a hierarchical network, a social one, all in our work world. And my question has been, and I had this question early in March, how are those networks going to change with people being remote? And so I'm trying to better understand. I think we can all say that it's not treating all people equally. The easy one to go back to is gender, and that women who are more likely to have caregiving roles may not be having the same experience that others are having. But we could apply that to things that we can see and not see. But the more that we can understand how those networks are changing, goes back to what Ava was saying earlier, we need to mitigate. It's not to say that everything was perfect in the office. The office presented maybe some opportunities to see what's on the periphery. Now our periphery is a bit missing, it's blocked. So if our networks are different, and if they are maybe compromised in ways that I'm not seeing the same opportunities, I'm not meeting the same people, how do we mitigate that through all the tools that we have? And the data is just not entirely there. I will tell you that we're doing some of this data analysis for a client who we saw that by way of formal communication channels, so meetings and emails, 80% of the employees did not have a one-on-one formal calendared time with their manager over a month. And that's a high number. Interestingly, that number hasn't changed over the last 6 months. So it's not necessarily telling me that the variable of place mattered, because you had place, you don't have place, there's no difference. But what it does say is this is an organization who hasn't figured out that maybe they need to mitigate that. And if we looked at the experience those people are having, would we see something more compromised than what they had before? So I don't know if those people were jumping into a meeting room or an office with someone and had the relationship that way, but we have no evidence that formally it's happening. So that's just one example, and the ability of the organizational network analysis data, which is based on the digital footprint that we leave. So it's looking at the metadata of relationships. It's not looking at the email Jamie sent me, but it knows that Jamie sent me a message and she sent me one back in 10 minutes. The more times the algorithm sees that, that's a symbiotic relationship, not something that you're just sending me junk mail. So if we can continue to mine this and look at different attributes, will we begin to see where we have to invest more of our efforts in one area versus another?
Absolutely. And Ava, I know you also are diving even into probably a lot of policy and government activism to kind of help support the growth of what needs to happen, and heard it called reskilling revolution in the labor market and a lot of other terms. But, we're seeing an influx of talent from the market, which may be newer talent. Perhaps they had a career before they're returning to the workforce, or a veteran who has decided to either continue or begin a career. There's a lot of change in that regard to the talent landscape, which does require change from these organizations and from our government. Is there anything in particular that you're finding is a helpful change or is moving forward, or are there any setbacks there?
Yeah, so we're seeing that work is changing in a lot of ways. I think that, the rise of, computer science and developers, and I think there's a lot of investment in tech. And I think the government is trying to invest in scholarships and opportunities, and we're seeing investment in women in tech too. And I think there's a major push there. I do think what's exciting for us at Simba is that we see internships are so much more than just students getting experience in their dream job. It's also moms who might be, changing their career of choice. We met, early on starting Simba, a mom who was in a coding boot camp, who taught herself entirely how to code, who had previously been in another industry and now wanted to become an engineer, and she surpassed all of the coding exams that we sent her way. And for us, it was so exciting because she was telling us about her kids and how she wants to aspire for them to aspire to see what she's doing. And so we are thrilled to see different people be able to tap into remote internships, because a mom might not be able to go into an office in New York City when she's raising kids, and a flexible remote internship can offer that for her. Also, remote internships don't need to be that 40-hour-a-week experience. I did my first remote internship with the U.S. Department of State when I was in college in Tucson, Arizona. And that experience, I did most of my work at 2 a.m. Because I was in school all day. And it didn't really matter for the organization because they gave me research projects and I could work on them at any time. And then I would submit them at the end. So it was more project-based. And then when I was on the phone with them, it was all about mentorship. So we're excited about that new wave and approach and investment in talent, no matter where it is in the country or what stage in life or education they have. So I think that that's something also really important to note when we look at the remote workforce and how I think talent and opportunities are changing. I'm very curious to see, when a lot of companies have stopped hiring, some companies have expedited hiring, and what types of positions they're going to be looking for as well in the new post-COVID world. And which ones of those are going to be remote flexible or must be in person as well.
I am very curious to see how it all shakes out. I feel like it changes every day, but it's an exciting time to kind of be in the middle of it, as you both definitely are. And I think the work you're both doing is commendable. So thank you for being part of this conversation. It's clearly a continued conversation. I think we are building opportunities. I think we are still learning how to reach all of the diverse audiences that we want to. And certainly what is needed to provide that sense of belonging and balance between our digital and physical places. I think, we're kind of all pioneering that right now. If there's questions that any of the audience members have, we would love to hear them. We haven't gotten a ton. But whether it's that you want to connect with Rachel on LinkedIn or Ava or myself, we are happy to continue this conversation to talk about your individual experiences because we know they are all unique, and we welcome those unique perspectives. I would love to hear your story, and you can always reach out to communications@atriumstaff.com at any time. My team would love to hear your stories. So, I will send it back to you guys, Rachel and Ava, in case you have any final thoughts, and really appreciate everyone for tuning in this morning.
I don't have a whole lot to add, just it's been a great conversation, and I think Ava and I have probably enjoyed sort of the perspectives that each of us are bringing to how business and relationships and opportunities and place, whether it's digital or physical, are changing. And we've never, obviously, but never experienced something like this, where we are starting effectively from ground zero to say, let's now build what we want. And there's a lot less of sort of the history of, well, we've always done it this way. There has to be a question. It's making it quite hard for our clients who don't know which question to answer first. But at the same time, it does sort of toss everything up and allows us to let it fall into ways that historically we didn't have permission to solve all of that, or clients didn't want to solve this problem on the left and that problem on the right. Let's just solve this one. And it's the imperative now that we look at it in a much more whole system way. So let's hope that the negative of what's happened is actually our opportunity to change our future.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. I was incredibly excited to join the conversation and share my experience, as well as the youth perspective in this conversation. And I would love to just really hone in that work is changing, and work has always been changing. I think what happened is we had a little bit of an expedited shift to remote work, but remote work was on the rise. And I think we're seeing it's going to be very unique how the next generation of talent embraces this, because all of them right now are in virtual classrooms and all of them are in virtual universities. How are they building those relationships when all of us talk about universities and a lot about the experience of youth being around relationships? I think we're going to have a lot of exciting innovations and a lot of learning from youth around how do we move forward. So be a listener and always check in with your employees. I could not believe, Rachel, when you told me it was 80% of people have not had one check-in. That is a shame. So if you're a manager listening in, make sure that you're setting time to stand up and do a check-in with people, listen to your team and ask them how they're doing, and make strides in the right effort. So we're grateful to be a part of this conversation. Thank you so much, Jamie and Rachel.
Thank you guys so much.